Okay, so I had a request from a student to create a tutorial covering the looping of this little hop. It's basically like a walk cycle, right? We have the character. I will go ahead and play this. I have character Boxee here, doing a little bounce in place, fully intending for Boxee to be moving forward, right? It's just is happening, and I could animate it that way if I wanted to. I could certainly animate the main controller, but the idea is just to see how you could do a clip of animation, a portion of animation, and then extend it out. And in fact, I use this word clip. There's a way to use a clip system, just as you would, say, in Premiere or iMovie or whatever video editing, right, where you have a clip and you can duplicate it and have it loop. Here, we could do the same thing with animation. That gets a little more complicated. Not too complicated, but so I wanted to look at a different way to do this using a curve. I also wanted to show how you can animate things along a curve because it's very helpful, like when we do some work later on, more kind of procedural animations with MoGraph and tracers and things like that. So anyhow, so the request was just to show how to loop this animation. And there's several things we need to do. The first thing is to attach our character to a curve so that we can see that it's going along a path. And then obviously we need the animation to loop itself. So we'll look at how to do that and some little things you have to make sure you do so that it works right. Okay, so I'm going to go to, make sure I have my timeline set up. Let's toggle here to my top view. And maybe I'll just make the display. Oh, I already have it set up wireframe. I've got my stage hidden here, but it's showing as a solid shaded. That's okay. I'm going to go up to the Spline Pen Tool. And as I mentioned in class, there's various mathematical models that you could use to draw, say, a straight, from point to point, it would be a straight line or some kind of rounding. I'm just going to use B-spline, I guess, here. And really what I want to do is the curve, and when I say curve, I really just mean a somewhat straight line that maybe has a little bit of variation, right? I just don't want the character to be just perfectly straight, just because I don't like it when everything's perfectly straight. So just so that you can see me drawing it instead of drawing it on top of this stage here. In fact, maybe what I'll do is, this will be easier if I just hide the stage. But I have an idea that, or as we can see here, if I hold the stage. So basically the length of the window that I have up here. I'm going to make it go the full stage. So I'll turn that off and I will just draw. And I'm just clicking, right, and right, so the character, and then I'll hit enter to complete that. Okay, so I have something that doesn't have too much variation in it. It has a swoop in it. That's okay. I just don't want any big changes. And let me go back to my, let me select the spline here. And you can see it says B-spline, so this is the curvature model for it. It still has these points in here. The nice thing with B-spline, as you can see, is this point is like dragging on the curve itself, and there's a bunch of mathematical rounding going on. The other thing you should know about this is that to get this curvature, like this is a control point, but the actual points that are defining the curve, there's intermediate adaptive points in here, and if there's more curvature, it puts more invisible kind of adaptive points. And when there's less curvature, it doesn't put as many. You would definitely see this if you were modeling using curves. The thing you just need to know here is that if you had a curve that had a lot of variation in it, and these adaptive points, it can change the speed of the way the object is going to move along the curve, right? Because it would move from point to point, and it would be moving at the same speed, but if the points are further and closer together, blah, 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 the main thing you need to know is just change the intermediate points to uniform so that we'll have a uniform speed as it moves forward. You can experiment with that later on. It won't make as big a difference here because our curve doesn't have a lot of change in detail. It's not like it has an S-curve right in the middle and then straight lines on the end. Just has a gradual little swoop to it. Okay, so I've drawn the curve, but the curve's not doing anything at this point. It's just defined as a path for my character to bounce along. So I need to constrain the controller, but the controller here, I've already animated its attributes. I don't want to nullify those with some kind of a constraint, right? Some bit of programming that says, hey, you controller, follow this path. So anytime you're using some kind of constraint, which we'll do in a second, what you're going to want to do is have a couple different groups. Well, at least one, basically is a way to protect it. This is kind of like the roller coaster, right? If I were in a roller coaster and I wanted to film, you know, what it looked from the top of the roller coaster looking out over the ocean or whatever that might be, right? The roller coaster car that I'm sitting in is constrained to the track. I am relatively constrained to the car, but I can still move around and look different ways. And then, of course, I obviously can move my camera to point in a different direction. So it has its own freedom to do things. That's what we need to do. We have me, right, or the person in the car, we could animate the eyeball looking somewhere as if that was the camera. But what we need is some kind of fake object or invisible object to act like the cart on the roller coaster that's going to follow this path, right? That's going to follow this curve down here. Okay, so let's go up and let's just create a null object, and I'll just do it again. I'm going to have two of them, and I will name this one Boxee Spline Follow, and let's name this one Boxee Rote Correct. Right, so this is going to be a rotation correct in case I need it. I have a good feeling I'm going to need it. So how many of these do you need? It depends. Sometimes you might have to be like, oh, actually, if I constrain it that way, I don't have the freedom I need to animate it a certain way. So, but use these empty group objects to help you out. So the other thing, too, is I'll take the Spline Follow, and it displays as a dot, as a default, so it's just a little point we can't see there. I can turn it into anything. Right? I could make it a star in there, and let's make its size bigger. And let's see, where did it go? Let's see if I turned off, there we go. So in the filter I had the null turned off, right? So it's just a way of seeing where that object is. It's dependent on the curve, or the viewport. I could also, easier way to do this is a locator. So a locator is like a plus sign in that space. That allows us to kind of see it as it animates. So I'm going to take the Boxee Rote Correct null, and I'm just going to parent it, right? So these are exactly the same spot, 0, 0, and this is a child of it at exactly 0, 0, so lined up with that. And then what I'm going to do is take the Boxee root control, and before I do that, I want to put it at the very beginning of the animation. Now, part of this is built on the idea that when you were animating the Boxee root control, that the very first frame would have been at 0, 0, 0, right? That you were starting from that center point, because we talked about it just making bounce straight up and not move forward. So that's kind of an important part of this. So I'm going to move to frame 0, so when I parent it, just to make sure that they're lined up where I want. Oops, there we go. So I have this spline, I'll call this Boxee path spline. Okay, so we still don't have it following any kind of path, right? It just pops up and down, and we have a curve back here. So to make this follow, easy enough, as I like to joke, if you need some special operation in Cinema 4D, there's a path or there's a tag for that. And right at the very top, we have an animation tag called align to spline. Align to path is like align to the path of another animated object, but we want align to spline. Oops, and we want to put that, I had the wrong object selected. Let's just do it again so I can clarify. So what I need is for this object to follow this spline. So I'm going to select, again, the Spline Follow and say align to spline. And as soon as I create that, with the tag selected, you can see it says Spline Path. Well, which one do you want it to follow? I want it to follow this one. And I'm just left mouse button, click, drag and drop. Right? And so we can see now my character is all the way at the very end of the spline, right? It's not going anywhere. So the position defines how the spline, in fact, you know what, let's change this spline so it has a color to it. Let's make this nice and blue. There we go. All right, so we want it to follow it. And to do this, we would animate this position. Right? So I'm going to make my frame or my animation 300 frames. And at the very beginning of the animation, I'm going to go and put a keyframe at frame 0. Now, I don't want to move it until my character comes off the ground, right? As it jumps, that's when it's going to start to move here, right? So the frame before it leaves the ground, I need to make sure that it hasn't moved anywhere along the spline, right? So again, I will keyframe it at frame 0, or at position 0 along the curve. And then it goes up in the air and it comes down and lands. I'm going to have it right there at frame 30. Have traveled 10%. In fact, let's do it so it's visible. I'm going to do 20%. And I'll put a keyframe there. And my hop cycle is 31 frames. So I'm also going to put a key right here at the end. I cannot stress this enough. When you are doing these loops, and we're going to turn this into a loop as well, you need to put a keyframe at the very beginning and the very end of whatever that loop is. And we'll look at that here in a second, like why that can cause a problem. So let's see what we got here. Right? So it continues to just move along here, but it's not going any further, right? Because what we need it to do is stay on the ground again for that, while it's on the ground, right? We don't want it to move along the spline. So we'll come back to that. But the other thing we need to do is we need the character to loop, right? Right now it's only doing one hop. To figure out how this is working within our little animation, we need to see that continuing on. So this is 300 frames. I'm going to go to timeline, and let's click on the Boxee root control. And I should see all the attributes down here. I have the aim target and the root control, and I've got the middle control. And I'm going to just hold down Shift to select all those, and then H on my keyboard so that I can see all of the curves here. So I'm going to just scale this in a little bit here. If I look at my animation, and I don't know how well this will come through for some of this on the screen capture. You can see all my curves, and they're colored, right, based on some various attributes that they might be. But hopefully you can see that none of them end until they get to 31, and they all have a keyframe at frame 0, right? I do not have an attribute sitting here that just has a keyframe at frame 12 and 20, and then nothing in between there. And the reason I can tell that for sure is, as a default, the animation program creates an infinite repeat. And we're going to look at this in a second. Instead of looping the animation, it says just be constant until you get to the keyframe information, right? So it almost considers all the animation a loop, right? It just says before any animation, be consistently whatever that first keyframe is, and then once you get to the end of that animation, let's follow this curve, right? This one comes down and it goes up and it goes over, You can see, and then we see another black line. So this, these frames over here, if I go to function track after, you can see it's already set at a type of loop. It just happens to be constant after. So once you get to frame 31, which is the very last value, right? And that value is 100%, or whatever this is, whatever blink or whatever attribute is that I'm using. Then just loop that and imagine infinitely out in time, there's another keyframe that's exactly that value, right? So, but that's not what we want. We want this to loop, right? So I'm gonna select all those keyframes. I think you can just select all the curves, but I always like to just select the keyframes, just make sure I have all of them. And I'm gonna go to function, track after, and we want this to repeat, right? Continue after would be, taking whatever rate is happening. If you want it to just end, we're going to look at several of these, but the main one we want here is just repeat after. And as soon as I change that, right, you can see that this loop comes along, and when it gets to frame 31, it copies and pastes this frame right on top of it, and it continues. Now, hopefully you can see why it's very important to make sure that whatever value you have for an attribute at frame 0 is the same one at the very end of the animation, or else we would get a big jump in whatever that is. I'm not even sure. We probably won't see it. I think that's a blink. But if it was the position or the rotation, right, there would be like a weird spasm in the character or something like that. We obviously don't want that. All right, so let's see what we have here. So we can see my character is now continuing to go through its little loop. I can see that it has a little problem in here, though, already. So this is perfect. I actually did this beforehand. I deleted a couple keyframes on the rotation so that we could see this happen. So, right? And we can see it's hiding. That's where it is right there, we talked about earlier, and the way it's looping. All right, so let's go to the very beginning. Let's watch this. So this one looks right, but as this goes along, you're going to see, you see it's getting a little weird snap in it right there, right? So these are not mapping up to each other because I don't have a keyframe at 0, I have it at 1, and then I don't have one at 31, I have it at 30. So this loop is looping faster than all of the other stuff. Right, so eventually this gets offset, right? And as this goes along, I start getting this weird hiccup, and the rotation starts to happen a little bit earlier and a little bit earlier, so they're not in sync with the loop. Right? Can you see that little click? Let's rotate up here a little bit. Click, 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 right? So how do we fix that is very, very simple, right? Let's frame to the, in case you didn't know, this one here will frame based on the frame all. Again, the shortcut is H if you want to use that. So this one here, we had some keyframes. I just need this to be, the rotation here happens to be 0 at frame 1 for each one of those values. So I just need that to be the same thing at right, frame 0. You can see they're not keyframed, but they're at 0. You might have to copy and paste, right? I could have copied that and pasted keys in there. Of course, I don't want that flat. I don't want that to have a loop in it. The same thing here. This one comes in at frame 30, it's at 0. So I just need it at frame 31 because that's what everyone else is looping from to be there. And as soon as I add that new keyframe, you can see that or maybe you saw that. Let's watch that. Right, so it's looping based off wherever the end of the animation is, right? It just picks it up. So here, though, I'm just going to take that and say, all right, I'll just put a keyframe. So as I do that, you can see that the whole thing shifts over, right? So it incorporates that, and then it adds that one frame of pause there, and then it picks up the loop. So now when I do this, I won't get that little click. Right? Everything's going to be in sync with each other based on this loop. So if the idea is your loop is from 0 to 30 or 0 to 150, whatever it is, if there are other things in there that you're keyframing and you want them to loop, they have to have keyframes at 0 and 150. Even if you just made changes like at frame 100 to 110, right? You made it do like some little twist or something. You still need to say, hey, continue to do nothing until we get to the end of the loop. And then pick up the very beginning at 0 and loop accurately, right? So you can see no little click going on in there. All right, almost done. Okay, so let's get to the last part, I guess, would be the looping of the spline over here. So let's just turn on auto load. In fact, let's not turn on auto load because it's not set up. Let's drag. There we go. So I just took the tag and I dragged it into my timeline so that I could see this. So right now, this is kind of a loop, right? It's constant until it gets here. It's important in this case, let's just imagine if you're, depending on what you had keyframed, if you had something like this going on, where you had a big loop, this would look weird as it travels. In fact, let's watch that first one again, right? See how it basically goes straight up in the air and then travels? We do not want that. So we want all these keyframes to be, and the icon right here, for linear, right? So a constant rate. As soon as it leaves the ground, it's moving at whatever that speed is, and then it stops, right? Flat means no motion. All right, but we want this to continue on after this. So again, I'll just select the curve. I think it will work that way as well. But just select the curve, whether you select the keyframe or not. Let's go back to functions, track after, and this time we want it to repeat, but we also want it to offset. So we want it to continue to add to this. So it's going to just, when it picks up, it's not going to go down here and do it again. It's going to start here and then go up. So it will continue to go 20% and 40% and 60%. All right, so offset after. Right, and we can see that stair step of the keyframes going on. All right, one thing that we'll see if I look over here, the character is always lined up with its own animation information. It's following the path, but it's not changing its orientation to follow the path. Hopefully you can see this here at the end, right? Where it's facing over, it's almost jumping sideways. In some instances, maybe that would be the okay thing to do. In this one, that's probably not, the character should be pointing in the direction that it's heading. So let's go back up to the tag, and let's just make sure tangential is turned on, right? And automatically we get this last problem. So it's now following the path. You can see that it's rotating, but as we talked about in class, it's obviously pointing backwards. And this has to do because it said, hey, point the positive z-axis. There's no way to tell it to be the inverse of that, at least not that I know of. So the other way to take care of that is just have this little Boxee rotate correction. And this is exactly why you use these null objects, right, to help you correct kind of animation systems. So now we can see that my character is turning a little bit to follow the path. It's not a huge change here because it's not there's not a lot of variation in that curve, but it makes a difference, right? And then again, that little soft little arc of a path, right? I don't want too much variation or it would look like the character is moving while it's in the air. And at this point, that works pretty well. Okay, so let's recap. You're going to need a couple null objects, and we're going to parent the rest of our character to it, right? So that we have this spline for it to look at. We're going to need a tag, right? Under tags, animation, align to spline. Don't use path. We want align to spline. For that, we animate it by, we move it along the spline by changing position, and obviously we need to animate that. We drag and drop a path into this so it knows which path to follow. And then for the character, we made sure, H, again on our hotkey, right, that all of the attributes are selected. Oops, I just want these. I don't want the line spline here. So these are just repeating. One student in class has some attributes for Boxee, like rotation, where it needs to actually repeat and offset, right? So if you made Boxee go up in the air and do a flip, it would go from 0 to 360, from 360 to 720, and for that attribute, you would want it to, instead of just repeat after, you would want it to be offset, repeat after. Okay. But, you know, this is just a great system. There's so much you could do with all that. If I, just going to create all Boxee. I'm going to put everything here in this group. And then what I'll do is duplicate a new one. And make sure that this follows. Name this one. Okay, good. I have that path. So now what I will do is take the path, move it off to the side. Maybe I'll go into edit mode. Tweak a couple of these curves. All right, good enough. And then maybe for the last thing I'll show, again, because of this whole idea of offset, let's go to so this is the second Boxee character, right? So it has its own set of controls in here. If I go to the, let's actually go to the, select all of this. I guess that one as well. And so we can see that we have, well, let's do it with this one. So we have all the looping here, right, happening. But what if we looped it at the very beginning for all this? So instead of after, let's say track before, actually repeat with offset. So I'll get the same thing leading into it. And this one I would do, this one actually I'll leave right where it's at. So I'm not going to do anything with this. But this one, I'll go into the dope sheet. What I'm going to do is just, with everything selected for that character, I'm just going to offset the animation. Right? So the whole idea that within this system we could create a little offset. I'd have to also, let's take this one. Make sure that lines up as well. Okay, so the whole thing's contained within the system. We're using the offset. It's valuable to us both at the, right? It's valuable to us at the end, but it's also valuable at the beginning, because then we can say when I start the animation, let's have everything kind of in a different place. Right? And this is working really well for us. Okay, almost 30 minutes. That's a lot of tutorialing. Is that a word? I don't know. Anyways, happy animating.